Hello. The catalog and queer library issues will resume now. We're going to start with our lightning rounds. I would like to welcome our first lightning round presenter, Nicholas Norton. Nick, if you are there, please turn on your camera now.
It says you can't start your video because the host has stopped it.
Carol.
Oh, okay, I'm back. Alrighty, let me share my screen. Alrighty, hello everyone. My name is Nicholas Norton. I am the Research Resources and Inclusivity Initiatives Law Librarian at Cornell Law School. And my lightning talk today is going to be on querying catalogs, bringing a critical eye to our collection development policies and workflows. And to give you a little bit of an overview, I started at Cornell approximately in April. So this is something that's been a new work experience for me and also for the Cornell Law Library team as we try to bring historically excluded peoples and their scholarship into the typical part of our workflow and to make it as operationalized as possible. So the goals of this, as I have in my infographic here, I'll zoom in a little bit, is to amplify the scholarship produced by historically excluded peoples, including Black, Brown, Indigenous, queer, differently abled, neurodivergent, and other historically oppressed groups as a part of our typical workflow. And the framework that I've been thinking about and developing, and welcome to any tweaks or edits that you might have and that you think would work in your particular context, is threefold. First, to evaluate our current collections and evaluate our current workflows as they happen. Second, to elevate materials we locate and procure as a part of this process, so to make them more visible. And then finally, to advocate and collaborate with others to bring them into this workflow and to expand our team of people working on this project. And then rinse and repeat, start this flow over and see where the results are taking you into different parts of the workflow so that you can then start to work on more and more issues within this space. So the way I've structured this talk is that I have an infographic here where I've broken the boxes into different stages of this workflow process. And so I'm going to walk you through it just so that you have a sense of what this could look like and maybe some ideas that you can use to implement it in your own process. So this first step I have is an evaluation. Do a diversity audit. So this could be making a list of topics and seeing where the gaps are in your collection, looking for relevant book awards for LGBT or other historically excluded peoples, and trying to elevate those materials, as we'll discuss next. Discussing past collection development strategies that you've seen at your particular institution's context. And then you could ask yourself and ask your team, how did those results shake out? How often should you think about repeating this step? And then even if you don't necessarily have a budget that can buy all of the things that you might want for the future, you as a part of this evaluation process can start a wish list for future purchases so that you know the universe of topics that you want to curate in the future. The second step is this elevation. So curating all of those things that you found in your diversity audit and that are already at your institutions. Thinking of ways in the second bullet about how those materials could be put together and presented. Should it be a LibGuide? Should it be a poster, a video, something to curate the content? Can you send email updates? As a part of the process, we can also collaborate, bring in those interested faculty members and different community members. What gaps do they notice in your collection? What input mechanisms are there for them? Have regular meetings with them. And then you can start the process over. Evaluate things like your collection development policy. What are the formal mechanisms in the collection development policy itself? How can you make regular updates part of the workflow? Elevating from there, are there opportunities to do book talks with student, faculty, or groups, going to classes, being the embedded librarian? Consider incorporating an overview of your collection work on a graphic on social media, promoting it as a part of orientation, all those great things. And then a different take on the collaboration could be how you can advocate. So how can this DEI work, the diversity, equity, and inclusion work, be incorporated into your university's existing committee structure? How are other units across your library system approaching their work? Who are your allies? Map that out. consult your allies and brainstorm what the ideal reality is. Do some synergistic brainstorming about what that utopia looks like in your head. So who are the stakeholders and how can they be persuaded to make progress? Consider making strategies to push for progress at various levels of that institution. Do another evaluation. How have past advocacy efforts gone? For time, I'll skip to our next elevation. Consider promoting open access materials, a final collaboration, go to conferences related to work, building diversity in the library, but then also go to conferences that aren't necessarily directly related to your workflow, but that could be something that will help you stay plugged into what this work is and how you can build bridges outside of just the library community. And then just the final bullet that I have is to be kind for yourself, that these structural systems of exclusion are something that were with us from the start of our careers and will continue to be with us. So fighting against these systems really does take a constant workflow and refinement in our daily practice. So lay the groundwork for those future victories, celebrate the small victories, and as you do this work, pay attention to your well-being and continue to take care of yourself. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. I would now like to welcome Henry Handley.
Hello, everyone. So I will do what everyone else has said and share my screen. And all right. So hi, everybody. I'm Henry Handley, he, him, or they, them pronouns. Today I'm presenting on In Not of the Library, Queer Library and Archives Workers in Catholic Collections. I'm at the Marion Library at the University of Dayton on the traditional lands of the Shawnee and Miami peoples. So first, why talk about Catholic collections at all in a queer symposium? First, and most obviously, Catholic academic libraries are simply academic libraries. There are over 200 Catholic institutions of higher ed in the US with varying degrees of identification and active participation in church life. And yes, there are LGBTQ people working here. For reasons it's not possible to go into in a lightning talk, being queer on a Catholic campus is complicated, and experiences don't vary not just from one campus to another, but from one department to another, including in the library. In the library, there are professional organizations like the Catholic Library Association and professional resources for managing and developing Catholic collections. For example, there's a well-established history of Catholic cataloging and subject classifications. And so if you have to self-fund your professional memberships or conferences, and you do a lot of work with Catholic collections, you may end up being torn on which groups you can afford to join. Special collections and archives can also represent the core of the Catholic institution's identity. So they hold university records, Catholic rare books and manuscripts that are often brought out to wild donors, draw in prospective students, and they can be used as centers of memory to confront and repair injustice as well. Vocational awe, coined by Fabazi Itar, is something all of us in libraries and archives face, and the Christian origins of the library that Itar notes are still central to the manifestations in Catholic repositories. Libraries like mine were run by members of religious orders, so brothers, sisters, priests, who professed vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, which doesn't necessarily include a work-life balance. Putting on huge annual Christmas exhibits, relying on parish volunteers, funding operations through donations, and otherwise tying one's professional life to spiritual life got a lot done, but left a lot of other things undone. There are no brothers and sisters working full-time at my library right now, but that doesn't mean that campus expectations for the library have drastically changed, or that those aren't another source of stress for folks who are already dealing with microaggressions or just plain aggressions, from acquiring, cataloging, even just weeding library materials, let alone library users or colleagues. So in the face of all of this, how do you make space for your queer self among a Catholic collection and a Catholic community that never anticipated you? I don't really have an answer. Academia and the church are bureaucracies, and bureaucracies will force you to pick your battles. Chances are you've already had some picked for you. If you have the funding and responsibility of shaping collections to add representation, that's great. But if you're queer and you're working with Catholic collections, being able to protect and defend yourself is your first priority. It can be hard to find yourself in a Catholic library, and my favorite example is on this slide. It's a 16th century book of sermons that had some very active readership with notes in the margins. And these hands, these manacles, are pointing out where the priest giving the sermon says sodomy is against human nature. So homophobia is not representation, obviously, and it's not a substitute for collection development. Unfortunately, I can do that. But something happened here, and it was definitely not straight. This is all to say that queer and trans folks shouldn't or should stay in Catholic libraries, but as this non-binary prayer card by artist Jonah Welch says, it's on my personal library altar, outside the church, the night is young. And so during working hours, at least, it's all but essential to incorporate critical librarianship, critical race theory into our work, to learn and implement trauma-informed practices, to resist vocational awe, and to move beyond patron and librarian binaries to acknowledge the potential for both intellectual and spiritual nourishment, as well as harm of many kinds for many people who interact with Catholic collections in different ways. We're all on different timelines of grief and healing in this world, and we need to be accomplices and not just allies for each other within libraries, within academia, within churches, and with all institutions that harbor and perpetuate oppression. So I know this is a pretty dense topic, but I appreciate your time. I'm always happy to talk and further brainstorm or share successes or just events. So feel free to email me or tweet. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Henry. I would now like to welcome Violet Fox and Haviva Avirom.
Sorry, I am working on sharing my screen. Is that good? Hi, my name is Haviva Avaram. I'm an asexual, and I am here to talk about asexuality in academic and in all libraries. I want to clarify that what I'm talking about is my personal experiences as a scholar, as an asexual person, and as an MLIS trained researcher looking for information at any level about asexuality. I'd like to start by talking to you a little bit about representation. As I'm sure everyone here knows, in terms of sexual and gender identity and identification, representation is key to discovering terminology to accurately describe your own state of being. Lack of representation can and does lead to people who can't explain their sexual orientation because they may not know that a term exists that describes how they feel. I was an undergraduate in college before I discovered asexuality, and I only found out it was a thing that I could be because of a fellow student who also identified herself as asexual. Once I knew about it, I immediately turned to the campus library to help me understand this new descriptor for myself. This was 2003, 2004. The internet didn't have the breadth of materials that are available now. And I came up pretty much blank. At the time, there were no books and very few journal articles about asexuality as a valid human sexual orientation. Though there has been some growth on that front, there is still a vanishingly small amount of material on asexuality available, and even less that is reliable and responsible in its presentation of the orientation. This lack of materials obviously provides fewer options for libraries to choose from in order to have breadth of asexual content represented in collections. That does not, however, make it less important to represent this already often invisible orientation. Because it's difficult to find materials about asexuality, there is additional urgency to having library staff who can help locate materials in a non-judgmental or pushy manner, and who can recognize what a search for asexuality may sound like, even when the questioner doesn't have the terms to describe what they're looking for. In schools in particular, it's important for materials on asexuality to be placed with resources on other sexual orientations and included when study and research guides are being created on queer topics or when informational displays are being created for pride events or campus queer groups. Asexuals already face pushback from both inside and outside the queer community about whether it should count as a facet of the queer community at all. Inclusivity from trusted sources like libraries can help normalize asexuality in the broader community. Though lack of published materials is a problem, it is especially important for campuses with education and teaching programs to provide resources suitable for different age groups so that educators in training are aware that such materials exist and can use them to support their students. Because there are very few monographs on asexuality and even fewer written for a layperson audience, it is important that libraries supplement monograph items with journals that publish a breadth of human sexuality-related information, including reputable articles on asexuality. There is also little to no guidance in identifying high-quality topics from those journals that are still presenting human asexuality as a medical problem or a psychological illness. Information literacy on the topic of asexuality is complicated by conflicting Information about whether asexuality exists, it does. Is a valid sexual orientation, it is. Is a queer identity, it is. And if it is a problem that requires medical or psychological intervention, it doesn't unless the asexual person is uncomfortable with how they feel, as well as what falls under the label asexuality, which is much too complicated for less than 5 minutes. Even if a library has resources about asexuality, locating them can be a frustrating experience for the querent. Searching on the words asexual or asexuality in either the book or journal collections usually leads to a lot of materials about asexual reproduction in plants and microscopic creatures, with the human asexuality materials buried under botany and cell biology. Neither limiting by keyword nor title help to clear out the unwanted topics. Some journal search engines will allow the user to limit a search by subject area, business, medicine, gender studies, but human sexuality and sexual orientations are not usual on that list. For more about cataloging and classification, I will turn it over to Violet.
Hello all. I'm a queer librarian involved in critical cataloging efforts. I'm going to jump right in. In 2016, Catherine Oliver and Netanel Ganin proposed a new LC subject heading for asexuality. It was rejected by LC for multiple reasons, which demonstrated misunderstandings about the nature of asexuality. LC's rationale for not accepting the proposal included suggesting that asexuality could be a biological condition, and that instead of a broader term of sexual orientation, the proposal might instead use a broader term of sex. Next slide. After the rejection, Catherine and Netanel worked with Jess Schomburg and me to address LC's concerns, finding more sources to confirm our original choice of broader term, and adding a parenthetical qualifier to the new proposal, asexuality, parentheses, sexual orientation. Both that heading and asexual people were approved and added to LCSH in 2016. You can find a detailed case study of the process of proposing those headings in Bree Watson's 2020 article in Cataloging and Classification Quarterly titled "There Was Sex But No Sexuality." Next slide. And then to switch tracks to the Dewey Decimal Classification, the history of a class number for asexuality is a really interesting case study into the editorial history of Dewey. Back in 1898, a number was introduced for the concept of neutral sexual orientation, 306.762, and that was renamed to asexuality in 2003. But the number was discontinued in 2007 because there had been very little use of it. In fact, though that Dewey number had been available for 18 years, in 2007, there were only 6 works in WorldCat that had that number, and 5 of those works were actually about eunuchs. Next slide. The literature had grown significantly since 2007. So in 2019, as one of the editors of Dewey, I worked to reinstate the Dewey number for asexuality. That required telling catalogers where to put works about eunuchs, specifically so they don't make that mistake of putting those works in the class number for asexuality. There's a great blog post about the history of asexuality in Dewey, which I would really highly recommend, by a Chilean librarian and asexuality activist. And that link is listed on our last slide, which we can flip to now. And here's our references. With that, we want to thank the conference organizers for putting together such a valuable event, and we're looking forward to your questions during the Q&A.
Thank you very much. Hi, Violet and Haviva. I'd like to welcome Monica now.
Hi, everyone. Just quickly share my slide. Can you all see this? Yeah. Hope so.
Not yet, Monica.
Yeah. Oh, gosh.
There we go.
Oh, okay. Excellent. Yay. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Monica Hannasakari. I'm an academic librarian in Richmond, Virginia. So today I'm just going to be showing you a brochure that was made by the iQuery organization over at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. iQuery is a graduate organization that focuses on empowering queer and trans individuals through community service and through challenging normalities in libraries. And this is just a quick little cute brochure that we did. It was a semester-long project. I was a former president of iQuery, and basically it was focused on LGBTQIA+ inclusivity in libraries and how to uplift and empower diverse communities in our libraries. It basically, I have updated it to include more tangible actions that a librarian can take, which includes challenging law enforcement in library spaces, as well as paying living wages to all your staff members. So I did want to just talk a little bit about understanding that libraries are a cultural sanctuary for so many people. It includes, of course, like access to librarians who give you help with resumes and technical stuff, but also there are free educational tools and language building opportunities here. It's really important that we remember that libraries are critical for the nourishment of our communities. I also like to emphasize that every library is different, but this country in particular in the United States is very diverse with a multitude of languages, cultures, ethnic identities, religions, sexual orientations, and gender expressions living side by side every day. We learn and grow with one another and should celebrate our differences in a safe environment. And one of the big things that I'm learning now as an academic librarian is that includes respect, and dehumanization is never to be accepted. And what we can do in your library if some folks are having difficulty explaining things to coworkers and colleagues, which I'm currently kind of going through. Some things that we had listed was like language is important, so be aware of the power of your words, respecting pronouns and names, instituting policies that protect marginalized members of your community, halting bullying when you see it happen, supporting patrons if they choose to come out and express themselves freely, incorporating LGBTQIA plus literature in collections and displays, divesting from law enforcement collaborations in your spaces, paying living wages to your staff, respecting people's privacy and confidentiality, and providing resources and training for your patrons and staff on addressing queer and trans issues. And so a lot of these have kind of been on shaky ground lately. Libraries are kind of going through this process of challenging, again, like not calling in security and law enforcement into library spaces, and kind of bringing back to the violence that happens to marginalized communities when libraries do incorporate law enforcement in their spaces. They just shouldn't be there. But yes, I just wanted to quickly share that was our brochure through iQuery, and I wanted to thank everyone so much for this opportunity. Thank you so much for having me, and I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Monica. I'd now like to welcome Carrie Prelitz.
Okay. Let me.
Okay, hi. Let me share my screen. Okay, everyone can see that? Yes. Okay, I'm gonna jump right into this. 5 minutes, here we go. I'm gonna talk about increased difficulties that LGBTQ librarians might face in the academic job market. So the academic librarian job market has been notoriously difficult for some time now. Back in the 90s, there was this myth of the profession graying out and that there would be this large amount of jobs opening up. But then around 2009 is when we start seeing a lot of articles being written about the difficult job market. And as you can see, that's right when ALA Job List reported a significant drop in their listings. But then it did seem to get a little better over the following years, but the market still remains pretty bleak. The 2020 Placements and Salaries Survey by Library Journals showed unemployment levels continued to grow and graduates working outside of library science tripled. And now we're already seeing the impact of the pandemic, and we're still in the middle of it. ALA Job List reported having a quarter of the listings in the summer 2020, and that entry and middle-level jobs were hit the most. So what do list grads do? Well, internships are problematic. They're usually unpaid, and that makes them more accessible to those with financial support from their families. And that's usually not the case for library science students. 78% of SJSU's list students worked while earning their degree. And it's even less often the case with LGBTQ students, who are less likely to receive financial support from their families and tend to live in areas with a higher cost of living. So relocating for a job can be more difficult for LGBT individuals as well. Federal housing anti-discrimination laws were only expanded a few months ago to include sexual orientation and gender identity. And with 1 in 3 LGBT people facing discrimination, 1 in 5 reporting, and 2 in 5 1 in 5 LGBT and 2 in 5 trans reporting having experienced a hate crime within the last year alone. Community is really important. So I'm going to quickly run through some state maps of factors that LGBTQ individuals might consider before relocating for a job. So LGBT individuals planning to adopt may need to consider state laws addressing adoption and foster care discrimination. Or families with children may consider anti-bullying state laws that specifically address LGBT students. Transgender individuals need to consider state healthcare exclusion laws. So it's not surprising when we see the map of the highest LGBT population density represented in the darkest areas here. But then if we look at a map of the librarian quotient, the light spots have the fewest librarians relative to the population. So we can see if we compare the two that those light areas match up with the densest LGBT population. So that means that those areas have the most competitive library job markets. And for LGBT librarians, it can be harder to move and harder to get a job. So it leads me to believe that LGBT library science grads might be more likely to work outside of library science and than that are non-LGBT. And I think that could be a really interesting study. Okay, Campus Pride is a website that puts together a list of the least friendly campuses for LGBT students and staff.
So sorry to interrupt you, Carrie. Your slides aren't progressing. So if you could.
Oh. They are on my screen. Interesting.
I am so sorry.
Sharing is paused. Okay. Am I still on slide 1 or?
You were on slide 1, yes. And now your screen shares off.
Okay. It was presenting on my screen. That is not good. Okay. Let's go to.
So sorry, don't worry, we do have a couple extra minutes.
Okay, I'll just go back and show the slides at the end, I guess. That's too bad. Are you seeing the vendor slide now?
Yes, perfect.
That's a bummer. Okay. So the Campus Pride is a website that puts together a list of the least friendly campuses for LGBT students and staff. And includes schools that might have a Title IX exemption, which allows discrimination based on religious beliefs. And while it's illegal for these schools to discriminate based as employers, they are allowed to give preference to employees that share religious beliefs. And a lot of these values might be explicitly anti-LGBT, so that path isn't for everyone. A less traditional path could be working as an academic librarian for a vendor, and there can be a lot of pros to this, especially those without experience. But a lot of vendors are located in red states, and the business sales world is still very heteronormative in the dress code. Even Disneyland has embraced gender inclusive employee dress codes, and I wish this was reflective in the academic library vendor world as well. Okay. Library schools, should they be pressured to change? Do they have an obligation to not turn out so many librarians? Should experience be required to get into library school if it's going to be a requirement to get a job after? Also, every MLS grad is told to network, but what does that even mean in a post-pandemic world? And really, it's not even a post-pandemic issue because most library schools have been online for over a decade now. They also told grads to be creative in the job search, and yet the curriculum really doesn't reflect that. There are really few classes on alternative library pathways. In general, there needs to be more emphasis on the post-graduation experience. One thing I wish I knew was just to start writing, and I was really intimidated because I thought I didn't have much to offer without having a lot of experience. But getting me on that pathway to publish or present would have really helped me a lot more than the e-portfolio I was told to put together. And academic libraries tend to focus on those with expertise still. I always hear librarianship is constantly changing and we need innovators who are passionate, and yet every job requires years of experience. I also just think more needs to be done on this topic. I focused a lot on recent grads, but there really isn't a lot of information on recruitment and retention strategies of LGBTQ academic librarians. There's a lot about LGBTQ patrons and collections, but what about the librarians themselves? Thank you. Yeah, and I can quickly, there were a lot of slides that not everyone got to see.
Yeah, we have an extra minute. Go right ahead and tell us about them.
Yeah, okay, so just the graying of the profession. Man, you missed my animation and everything. That's a bummer. So yeah, just the slides here. the state slides will go through really fast. The adoption and foster care, school anti-bullying, transgender healthcare, LGBT population density by state compared to the location,
You can take a little extra. Sorry, sorry, don't want to hurry you too much.
And yeah, so this is, you can see that the light areas compared to the dark areas line up. And that's it. It's all the rest. So.
Thank you very much. I love maps. I would now like to welcome back Nicholas Norton, Henry Handley, Violet Fox, Haviva Avirom, Monica Hannasakari, and Harry Prelitz. All right, we've got some questions for y'all. For Nicholas, could you speak more about challenges and opportunities for EDI specifically within a law library?
Sure, yeah. It's been interesting in the law library context because law schools tend to teach in a very rigid way that hasn't really changed a lot over the last century. And so they teach traditional like 1L, the first year law curricula. And so they learn property, they learn criminal law, civil procedure, all of these standard courses. And so what's been happening with the birth of anti-racism on college campuses in recent years and more pushes for EDI, we've been trying to incorporate more resources for specific 1L subjects. And so it's been interesting to map different opportunities to have that content available for the courses that already exist, but then also challenging the systemic structures of like law that reproduce a lot of inequities that exist because of that structure in the first place. So it's been, I think in the law library context, it is especially important, but it is something that is beneficial for every type of academic library to do, for sure.
Thank you. All right, this is for everyone. If you happen to know an answer to it, go ahead and raise your hand. Does anyone know of small grants to help folks begin to fill in DEI gaps in their collections? Audience, if anyone in the audience knows of anything, go ahead and put that in the chat. All right, I'm going to move on for that one for now, but if anybody thinks of one, we'll come back to it. For Monica, someone says, I was approached by a patron who conversed with me about a multitude of normal topics, but eventually started to discuss some very homophobic ideas. I quickly excused myself, but I wish I had said something to her. Do you have any guidance about how ignorance and intolerance should be approached in this context?
Sure. Yeah. So it's always really complicated because if you're a quote unquote a visibly marginalized person, if you're visibly queer, brown, and it's just, it can get very complicated very quickly from my experience about, because no matter what, it's going to be seen as a confrontation, no matter what your tone is, no matter what your posturing is. So I never fault anyone. And this is just from personal experience and whatnot. I'd never fault anyone for doing what they can to kind of de-escalate the situation. If it increases, or to excuse yourself, like what this person has done, just because like violence is it's running rampant in states in general, and public librarians especially know about that kind of struggle. But if that's a very long answer, is like always prioritize your safety, of course, and the safety of your staff and other patrons. But I would also say that what was helpful in previous libraries that I've been in is that having kind of a mission statement, and typically like having a mission statement and prioritizing paying for workshops that are hosted by queer and trans organizations, bringing people in to speak on their experiences, again, paying them. That's a big thing. Unfortunately, in higher education, they love free stuff. They love people just coming in for an hour and a half and not paying them. But I would say that it's a lot of it has to do with visibility and it just being threaded naturally throughout your library structure. So like, again, like in terms of combating homophobia and transphobia directly head on, again, like I understand prioritizing safety. Again, speaking as a queer brown woman, I come across a lot of you know, cis white men who have opinions. And so with that being said, I don't think that you could go wrong with, again, spotlighting things in your displays, in your presentations, in your mission statements on your website, what displays and what books that you have. And again, like, who are you paying? Who are you uplifting? Money talks. That's a big one. And I hope that's helpful. I'm sorry that I don't have a more concrete answer for you.
Thank you.
Of course.
For anyone who processes LGBTQIA plus collections, do y'all know of existing discussions of privacy issues, especially for folks who lived in the closet? I see Violet typing, but if you'd like to answer verbally, that is also an option now. If anyone else would like to answer, they can raise their hands.
Yeah, I'll just mention that there's a book related to the question of privacy issues called Ethical Questions in Name Authority Control. It has content with both libraries and archives. And I would particularly recommend a chapter that I co-wrote. It's actually the first chapter that's about reframing authority control from detective work to an ethic of care. My co-author recently passed away. Her name was Kelly Swickard, and she was a cataloger, but dealt with issues like that in her work as the archivist to artists and artist collections. So I would really highly recommend that book. I just put it in the chat, and happy to hear other folks' answers to that as well.
Thank you. Did anybody else want to chime in? Hand up. No, I'm gonna read some responses to our earliest question about finding small grants. Bree Watson said, re small grants to get started. It's a great idea. Perhaps something Homo IT could write into future grants. I'll make a note to do that. Rachel Gay says, and there's always the problem of trying to search for something you don't know, have the words for, even know exists. Oh, this is a question for Carrie. How do you suggest dealing with questions that seem aimed at having one, aimed at making you out yourself in an interview?
Well, I know at my institution, we have a meeting before we interview anyone to make sure that we don't have any questions that would do that. But as far as how someone else might actually take it if they felt they were put in that position is really up to the different individuals. I personally, when I lived in San Francisco, I worked for a vendor in a red state, and I actually had to straight out ask at one point, because this was before the Supreme Court decision, and I actually asked a supervisor whether or not I could possibly be fired for being gay. And I just had to flat out ask it because I was paranoid in my, in my head. But hopefully they're not asking questions to intentionally out you. But I also, you should be, depending on who you are, you might be open enough to share that and put it on the table. I wouldn't think you might want to work at an institution where that's going to be an issue. So it might be best to know ahead of time. But more and more, I think there should be a policy in place that those questions aren't being asked, but also in areas with that might not be as LGBT accepting, I think there should be maybe an onboarding that directly addresses like how we get more LGBT librarians in those areas and how to make them want to stay there instead of just moving for a job and moving back to somewhere they would rather live.
Thank you. All right, if anyone else has any questions, go ahead and put those in the Q&A. Violet's linked to that book, Ethical Questions in Named Authority Control. Yes, Aviva.
It's something that I've noticed a couple of times over the course of the morning. For me as an asexual person, when people use GLBT and LGBT, it feels directly exclusive to me. It's something that says your identity isn't really part of the queer community. And as someone whose identity in the queer community is questioned a lot, it feels aggressive, even though I'm sure that most people are not using it in an aggressive way. But part of what I was talking about in our presentation is the need to cultivate really intentional inclusivity of asexuality. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. And there's thanks for that in the chat. Yes, multiple people appreciate this. I have a question for Monica and anyone else, but first I'll give it to Monica, if we still have Monica. Excellent. Do you have any further ideas for how iSchool student orgs can bring awareness to these issues?
So issues being inclusive to LGBTQIA plus students, patrons.
Nathan, if you have that follow-up information, go ahead and put it. Yes.
So what I did at the University of Wisconsin, Madison, is basically pretty much just had to like get up in the face of all faculty and administrators. We were lucky in that like there were, you know, some pretty progressive and like-minded professors there, but then some who were not, who should have probably retired a long time ago. Oh no, I don't know if that's too spicy. But basically what we had to do, because for at least in higher education, you got to go through bureaucracy and administration constantly, but it was about being, so I'm a very loud person. I'm very like, I like to speak my mind and talk, and that's just like a personal thing. So I was able to like, again, cultivate that kind of relationship with administrators and faculty, but not everyone has that. That is just something that I kind of had to do, because like if you wanted money from the office, and if, I don't know, just like, there was just, it was a lot of just like, again, face-to-face interaction, constantly emailing things out, explaining why this conference would be beneficial, or why these scholarships should be made, or constantly having those conversations. So yeah, it involved basically a lot of face-to-face and encouraging, again, workshops and programming and events that were having them be, you know, posted all over the library and bringing people in. Again, it's a lot of collaborations, but that involved a lot of, again, sometimes an email just will not do. I hope that is helpful.
Thank you. And yes, I don't want to bash anyone based on age, but I do want to bash anyone based on holding on to bigoted conservative views that are falling out of favor well past due.
Yes, of course. Yes, I'm so sorry. Yeah, it wasn't a slight at age necessarily. It was more of a slight towards, again, very conservative, bigoted views that did actively harm the student population.
Thank you so much, Monica.
Thank you.
I have a question for Henry. How would you advise applicants for jobs in Catholic institutions to gauge their inclusivity/exclusivity of queer librarians?
So what I did before, I think my campus interview, back when we had campus interviews, I just searched the library catalog a lot, because I figure, I mean, it's not foolproof. There are definitely more open places on campus than others, and the library is fortunately one of them. But just figuring out, okay, would the library buy this book that I really like? Would the library like buy a book that has a little bit of a spicy take on like defunding the police or something like that, that maybe not everybody in the library will agree with, but they're at least willing to have that book in their collection. If they're willing to have like books on queer and trans folks in the collection, if they're making an effort, that's how I ended up where I am right now, basically, is that people are willing, just seeing that people are willing to make an effort, even if they don't have it together necessarily, that they're trying, and that they're willing to be open about that. Because the other issue about Catholic universities is they're often very sensitive about who's going to call them out for being not Catholic enough. And that's a whole other issue. But in my case, I think the library is usually, if they're showing that they're making an effort in collections, making an effort in their programming, outreach, things like that, that has been historically a good sign for me.
All right, thank you. And Violet's posted the obituary for people who might not have seen it. A good friend and a valuable member of the library metadata and zine librarians communities. Violet, was there anything else you wanted to say?
No. I just miss her terribly.
So sorry. For Haviva, are you currently doing any work or research related to asexuality in libraries?
I am muted. I am not. Up front, I am a person with a recent library degree who has not been able to get a job in libraries. So I am not currently doing any specific research about asexuality in libraries, though I am certainly open to the possibility. Kano, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that. I will drop my email into the chat and please hit me up.
Right, yeah. The follow-up was also, I've never met another asexual librarian, so your presence is appreciated. If you're open to collaboration, it would be great to talk sometime. It sounds like you are.
I am here. I am very, very ace. And I am happy to talk about it and collaborate about it.
Yeah, we've got yay for more ace librarians in the chat. All right, last call for questions for this group. All right, I would like to thank you all very much for your lightning presentations and answers. Monica is, well, sorry, Monica.
No, I'm sorry. Hi.
Hi. We actually have a couple of minutes extra. Does anyone have a final plug? I do. Seconding Monica's, libraries, pay your speakers. Everyone who controls purse budgets, if you have money and you want speakers, give the money to those speakers. It's so good.
Yes. Yep. Big thing right now. Pay people.
All right, this is it for our first round of lightning speakers. I'll let you all off the hook now.
Alrighty, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Taylor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Taylor.